I want bigger deer. Well, how do I get bigger deer? I guess plant more food plots, or I need more crops. No, I don't know why we keep going back to this. We're smarter than this. We know that deer were here long before food plots or crop fields were put on the landscape.
All right, what is up, everybody? I know you either have, you might have, maybe you're lucky enough to have, or you dream of having that perfect recreational property. Now, I know for me, personally, I don't have this piece yet, Jim, yet.
You got a pretty nice, what is that, a retention pond right outside in the back, in the quote, back 40?
Yeah,
that is 40 yards.
40 yards from
behind your house?
the back door, yes. So, yeah, that's as close as, and the thing is, here's what's sad. I'm super excited about this retention pond. The geese and ducks like to sit on it. I think with some management, there could be fish in it if it doesn't freeze all the way through. Anyway, has yet to be seen. However, if you have one of these places, Jim, what do you want on it?
Deer.
Big deer.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's easy to get.
A really big garage.
Hyper focused.
Actually, the whole thing can be a garage.
Nobody cares about
Never mind. Nobody cares about my preferences.
It's easy to get hyper focused on big deer. If you're a deer hunter, and maybe that's one of the primary reasons that you've purchased or been cultivating this recreational property, it's like, yeah, I want to hunt deer, I want to see big deer, but there's more to it. So we've got the guys, we got Matt and Adam from Land and Legacy to chat with us today about kind of a more holistic approach to property management. So we're talking biodiversity, multiple species, converging habitats that, it's as good for songbirds as it is for big bucks. And maybe, Jim, and I think we'll get to this answer, maybe all these things that you can do to create this ideal habitat and this fantastic ecosystem just equals big bucks at the end of the day anyway. So Matt.
Maybe.
Adam. Thank you for joining us today. We finally got there. Tell us a little bit about yourselves, if you can, and what you guys have going on at Land and Legacy.
Yeah, guys, thanks for having us. So I'm Adam, and I'm co-owner. We started this venture in 2017, and we assist landowners across the country. We started, like I said, 2017, and we started going kind of locally. Now, over the course of 4 years, we've been to pretty much Delaware in the Northeast or Pennsylvania. We've got some New York consults scheduled all the way to Texas, Florida to Minnesota. So every state in between that, we've been there. And we just help landowners reach their goals of healthier landscapes, whether it includes big deer or not. Oftentimes that's a result of a healthy ecosystem. And so we just help them basically get the most out of their farm with the least amount of dollars in the quickest amount of time as possible.
Yeah, those are all.
That makes sense.
That checklist works. That's a good one.
So, and that's cool. So you guys definitely aren't a one-trick pony in regard to landscapes. I mean, you're talking about Texas versus the Midwest versus. You guys are looking at a lot of different regions throughout the U.S.
A lot, and it's a lot to keep up with, but it's fascinating, honestly, going from one region to the other. To be able to see how the landscape changes drastically from one region to the other, and then how the climate plays into all of that equation as well. But the one way we attack it is by looking at or basing management off of principles that are true from Minnesota down to Florida, and we're managing the similar species of animals and similar types of plants, and we're going to disturb them in the similar ways, but working off of basic principles that are backed by research and science and the way, creation happens and occurs. That's how we get these results across the landscape and across the country.
Absolutely. One of the big things about that is obviously there's a difference between Texas and Minnesota. And so you look at it and have to manage it, manipulate it totally differently. If in Minnesota, our biggest stress period is that late winter, early spring, or what seems like half the year if you really want to talk about that stressful period of time. But in Texas, it's that late summer time period where it gets hot and dry and water is a limited resource. And so we really can't just go in with our little box of practices or tools and say, this is what you use. Each site's different. And not only just from region or state to state, but each individual property is different, whether it's being that we're managing timber or we're managing old fields or prairies. So it's a very fun line of work. And I mean, we have to continue to stay on top of things, learn about new research, and educate ourselves as we move forward in things, different plants or new invasive species or new treatment for those invasives. So it's just a fun career to be on, and it's great to see that landowners are benefiting from it.
How do a couple of guys like yourselves wind up getting into this stuff and actually understanding all of what goes into the? I mean, you're mentioning, you're talking about a lot of science and stuff here. It's not like necessarily just, oh yeah, my grandpa did this because he said X, Y, Z. My dad did it, and now we do it too. And it seems, like, how does that happen?
Yeah, that's funny you say that. Your grandpa did this, and so now I'm going to do it. That is something that, bless their hearts, I should say up front, is what grandpa did and what my father's done. I realized that, if I continue to do that, those quail numbers were here, and then they were here, and now they're here. And if I continue to do this, they're going to be gone. You won't even see them. And so kind of learning that what we've done in the past may not be the best practice. And so for me, I was blessed to be raised with a family farm. And just the bug bit me early on of, this is a lot of fun to try to manipulate the habitat to try to get more deer, because there wasn't many there when I was growing up. Turkeys were great. There was a few quail, but ultimately it was going, the direction that this is headed, I'm not sure I like that. I want to find a way to manage this farm to where we can still have cows, and we can have healthy forests, and we can have quail, and we can have turkeys, and we can grow and increase our deer herd. And so what does that look like? And so as a young man, kind of just looking around at the practices that government agencies or nonprofits are promoting, and then seeing what some of the people in the hunting world are doing. And then you can follow line of success with them and see, okay, they're doing something right. I wonder what it is. And over time, you just, I guess, more of from a watchful eye, you see what's working and what's not working. And for me, that's just, I don't know, it's just intriguing to see the landscape change and figure that stuff out. And so I got bit with that bug of land management early on and never really.
And you've got a degree in agriculture.
Yeah.
And I grew up very similar, family farm, loved to hunt, and was blessed to have tons of access to land growing up on the East Coast. For me, and Adam was kind of Midwest guy, but I've got a degree in wildlife management and just time, energy. And I think one of the questions that we both would look back and say that we've asked ourselves time and time again is looking at a system that is, let's say, status quo, and saying, why is it done that way? Why are people managing the land in this manner, or farming in this manner? And once you start to ask yourself why, and you have this foundation of knowledge to, use as a sounding board to kind of, let's say, fact check things, you realize quickly, maybe that's not the exact best way to do that. Then that's just kind of, let's say, the domino effect from there. Well, maybe this practice isn't necessarily the best, even though I see it happen a lot. Is there something better that I can do? Or is there a different approach I can take to get and yield the results you actually want that will make things function as a whole? And that's really what, he started doing when he was young in the Midwest. I was thinking and doing, and then our paths kind of collided. And now here we are, Land and Legacy, doing this across the country.
When you guys get a client, or maybe, looking at your client list as a whole, do they by and large have similar goals? Like, I imagine when you're looking at a property, it's like, well, what are your goals with the property? And for some, a person actually that might be just like, man, big bucks, that's what I care about, but maybe there's other goals. Or how does that, I guess, compare to, I guess I look at maybe somebody who is like, agriculture, like that's their living, is ag, right? Are they going to have different goals than a person who has, just, their back 40 and, they want a management for wildlife, and maybe they do have they lease part of that ground out for ag, but that's, mostly for them, it's just, I get a, little bit of coin in my pocket, and it increases the food potential on the property. What are you guys seeing as far as the people that you work with, as far as their goals in management?
overall, a lot of our clients have the same goal in mind. And it really comes down to two things. They want more deer, they want more wildlife, but they want to make sure they're doing the right thing for the landscape. And I think that's where we found a niche with clients. Is these are guys who, you know, some of them don't really care about shooting the biggest deer in the neighborhood or the biggest deer on the farm. They just want to have plenty of deer. So when they take their kids or other family members join them, they're going to see plenty of deer. But then we have some that are hardcore deer guys that are really focused on big deer, but at the same time, they're like, but I don't want to do anything that's detrimental to the overall landscape.
Right.
And so I would say as a base, all of our clients are caring of the land rather than just one specific animal.
And it's cool to see almost working with someone as you start this, let's say, relationship as a client. You hear the goals and you're really trying to get in tune with what it is you're trying to accomplish. And then over a year, 2-3 years time frame, that goal has now shifted as they've become more knowledgeable of working land and working the property, how in sync things can be or may not be. And then once they begin to learn those relationships, it's amazing to see, I care more about this land or this piece of property than I did when I bought it. And I loved it when I bought it, but now I know more. It's not just about big bucks, but guess what? I've got those too. And that's really cool to see that, let's say, evolution of a mindset change. And that's kind of a gauge for us to know and what we're doing, what we're preaching, what we're recommending, how we're helping these landowners throughout the process of owning the piece. It's working. It's working.
Yeah, I could see that, like, really opening up. Like, you might have, you know, kind of like these thoughts, but really the information that you guys have and the methods that you use, almost opening up like kind of like a whole new world to these landowners that, I mean, I think obviously they have an interest in the natural world. I think if you hunt or fish or whatever, like, you definitely have, you know, an interest in and a passion and a leaning towards, you know, the natural world. But I guess a deeper knowledge, a deeper connection, you know, and that, you know, it's like, oh yeah, planting food plots is super cool, and you actually learn, you know, some of that egg stuff, but then also oak regeneration. That's cool too. So there's a lot going on there.
I've got a short story kind of client that he's in Pennsylvania. He hired us. I assisted him, and he was all about big deer. I'm sick of shooting small PA bucks. I want to have more big deer. I want to kind of be the main farm in the neighborhood that's killing the big deer. And we started a major timber harvest and a major timber management project where he went in and did lots of thinning, hauled a lot of lumber out, trying to get some new just forest regeneration, some young forest. So he has more woody browse and he has more cover available. And in the process of that, basically he created some beautiful woodlands, which for people not familiar, we're not talking about just a chunk of timber. We're talking about woodlands that have more, you know, if we're talking percentages, probably 60 to 80% canopy, but the rest of it being open. So you can go into it and see blue sky, see sunlight hitting the forest floor. So there's a lot more plants growing. And because there's more plants growing, there's more insects available, which means that there's more birds in the landscape. And I was with him a couple of years ago in the middle of the winter. He started logging, hired me to come back the next year to make sure that after the logging that he was still headed in the right direction. And next year we were there. It was in the spring, and we're walking along, and he's like, "Whoa! Look right there!" It was a beautiful scarlet tanager, which is a bright red bird, little bitty thing. But he's like all excited, and I just laughed. I said, "You know, Rob, when I was here last time, you said you only cared about big deer. What are you doing stopping me for birds?" And he goes, "I know it, but this landscape's changed so much, and I can see all the wildlife now. It's just exciting." And you know, for a guy like him who was so dead set on big deer to change in that short amount of time, and now when he's talking about his land, he can go around talking about all the things he's doing for all the wildlife, that I think for people that are sitting on the fence that aren't hunters could be like, you know, that's really cool what you got going on, rather than him saying, yeah, I'm planting food plots to shoot big deer. And we've seen that time and time again from landowners who are doing things the right way, managing for a healthy native ecosystem, and at the same time they're getting more people introduced and enjoying it because they're not just going out to kill something.
I was gonna say we just did a podcast. I think it's about to release with one of our in-house guys, Mike McDowell, big birder, big time birder, and it was actually, I think the podcast is like from birder to shooter or something like that. We might have to podcast with this guy from big buck hunter to birder.
To birder. That's right. I'm curious, like when you're talking about going about it the right way and actually managing it in a way that the whole ecosystem benefits and everything, all the different critters and wildlife aspects of the land benefits. So are there ways then that people have gone about things sort of classically or in the past that are actually damaging to the ecosystem as a whole? And I guess what would that be? I'm trying to picture what someone might do. That they'd be like, well, I just want big bucks, and they go and do blank to their land, and actually maybe that does somehow deliver big bucks, so to speak, but everything else completely sort of is in bad shape afterwards. Does that make sense?
That totally. And we see that a lot. I mean, that's a big part of our business is trying to correct those errors that have been made in past years. Some of the big ones that people have made would be introducing invasive species or non-native species when there's a perfectly good native species to fill that role. Some of the most common ones we see would be autumn olive for screening or autumn olive for old fields, which you guys up in Wisconsin probably have a good amount of autumn olive, or bush honeysuckle being another one that people are maybe promoting or they've planted because they're trying to find something that's not being provided by a native. And it could just be the fact that the native was removed years prior to their land ownership, and they didn't realize that they could have a native in the place of what that invasive is doing. Some of the others would be just lots of one that really kind of burns me is when I see a prairie or a nice, beautiful old field that's very diverse and it's got quail or pheasants. It's got fawns in the spring and turkey poults. And then they go in and they plow it up and make a mediocre food plot. They don't do the soil amendments correctly, and they have a food plot that's a failure when just a year prior they had a diverse old field or prairie that looked beautiful. And another common one that we use, so I'll say it's a practice, but sometimes it gets overused, is hinge cutting. Hinge cutting is a very popular one right now for in your timber areas. I mean, if you're in the north, if you haven't heard about hinge cutting, you've got your head under a rock. And people use it a lot. And like I said, we do too. But a lot of times we see that go into a woodlot and there's like really nice, healthy looking oaks or walnuts or any other native species. And they get hinge cut over and they do the whole area in hinge cuts. And so because of that, they don't get enough sunlight, so you don't really stimulate the forbs or the grasses that could be growing. You basically just lowered the canopy down 15 to 25 foot, and you've also damaged a lot of really nice timber to where there's never going to be a timber harvest right there with it in that condition. So those are some of the most common ones.
I think a lot of times what we see is people grasping for something that's going to have a quick response, something that's very visual, that's going to change and say, wow, I made a difference. And in that case, with hinge cutting, then that tool or that technique is way overused. Where instead of doing it 100%, maybe you should have only done 20% of what you did and incorporated other types of felling trees or other types of opening the canopy to get an actually desirable response. So you see a technique that is used become way overused, and now we have detrimental effects. And now a logger's not getting back in there for the foreseeable future. There's no log quality whatsoever, but we could have gotten a better result by decreasing the amount of a hinge cut and incorporated many other types of
I mean, that's tough though, because I mean, running a chainsaw is just so damn awesome.
I
can see where these guys are going. They're like, hinge cut it all.
My uncle Bill, he was always known growing up as, they'd say, oh yeah, Bill, if a little's good, a lot's a lot better. That was his MO, and I guarantee he would hinge cut the living snot out of anything he ran into. But it does make sense. I think a lot of times it's easy to like
You do.
So
You fall into a trap of wanting those short-term gains that,
Right.
you know, like anything, like that magic bullet, you know, this is going to be the ticket. And, you know, which actually kind of made me think of another question. So, like, the answer is probably like a lot of things. It depends, right? It probably depends on where property is at and where you're trying to get it. But, like, what would be like an average approach to be like, okay, you know, is that 2 years, 4 years? Is that for the life of the property? You're always going to be, you know, doing things, or?
It's a great question, and it drastically depends on where you start with.
Yeah.
You know, if the property was previously mismanaged from previous, you know, poor logging in years past, well, now we got to, you know, look at what resources we're starting with and decide how long is it going to take me to get to that desired result? And it may be for some guys 3 years. For some guys, it may be 10 years, and a very multi-step staged process. And that's why buying the right piece of property and identifying what it is you're starting with and the resources available is super important. But really, land management shouldn't ever stop. If you're the owner of that property, you should be tweaking, fine-tuning, using prescribed fire as a maintenance tool to keep habitat in its condition for prime regeneration.
I'll kind of play your game to your question and rather give the correct answer of it depends, but I'll play the game of the what ifs. And first off, I'll say our management techniques, we oftentimes as a joke started it and it really caught on with our listeners, but we call it 80 grit land management. And so if you're a carpenter, you realize that if you've got a rough piece of lumber, you're not going to go in with 220 grit and expect to have great results. So you're going to start out 80 grit and you're just going to try to knock the property into shape. And then you can step back in a few years and go 220 grit. And a lot of times, so if let's just picture you have a 100-acre parcel and it's 75% forest, okay, and you have great access to where you can maneuver around this whole woodlot. We're going to try to go with year one, let's try to do some work that gets the best results to where not only is it helping the deer and the wildlife, but it's something that is really helping your hunting strategy. And so let's just say we locate a few areas, four areas to do 3/4 acre bedding thickets, as we call them, or micro clear cuts. And these are areas where the timber is not valuable. It's probably some lower quality timber, or even if it is hardwoods, they're not in the shape or structure that's going to provide a harvest in the future. So we're just going to clear cut it. And we're going to mix in some hinge cuts. And we're going to mix in a bunch of flush cuts. And that's going to allow the deer to maneuver all the way through the area, rather than if you hinge cut all of it and they can't really penetrate, but to the center, they're just using the fringes. So we're going to do that strategically laid out on the farm to where you kind of create a whirlpool effect where deer are moving from one to the other during the rut, but they're having the ability to space out and bed in these really quality bedding areas. And so that would be like year one or complete by year two. And then year 3 and 4 and 5, we're going to focus on overall timber stand improvement. And so from those dense pockets, we're going to go off of that and try to open up the canopy, remove the bad trees, just cut them. And if I'm in the northern part of the United States, I know that woody browse is incredibly limited. So I'm not going to treat many species with herbicide. I'm just going to let them grow back. And deer are probably going to keep them in check to where I don't have to worry about them growing out of reach of the deer. I don't have to worry about 10-foot tall saplings in the future. So I'm going to thin the timber, get some sunlight in. So I'm going to get some forbs, which are going to be great during the growing season for forage. And overall, over the course of 5 years, I've changed my woodlot to be not only really awesome as a hunter, but really awesome to help lower those stress levels and promote healthier deer and overall a healthier ecosystem.
Is it best to start with, like, are you in a better spot if you're starting with a piece of land that is primarily wooded? Or what if you're somebody who starts with a piece of land that has mostly ag, you know, and maybe a farmer comes and does their thing throughout the farming season, and then, you know, but there's just mostly woods around the edge or something like that, or woods in just one little part of it. Are you at a disadvantage if you're that guy, or?
Well, it depends. And so I would say it's a lot easier to get denser cover quicker with a woodlot with timber than it is to go from a crop field. You know, crops are great, and wildlife, let's talk specifically deer, are going to use the crop field. But at the same time, during hunting season, they're still, for the most part, bedded down during the day. And where are they bedded down during the day? The most secure cover they can find. So if I'm a guy searching for a farm and my goals are deer, I want to make sure there is at least a wood component, a forest somewhere on it, where I can create that.
Yeah.
I will say, over time, with given, time to be able to execute things, some of the best farms and responses that we've seen have been old abandoned cattle farms. Now, again, there's a lot of techniques and a lot of time that goes into it, but if we're looking for quick results, think of a crop farm or a tillable field. That's year zero from vegetation, right? It is a moonscape. It is pretty much chisel plowed dirt in most cases. So you're starting with zero. Whereas there's something to work with on portions that are timbered. Yes, we're going to go in and cut, but there's lots of roots that are already taken root, let's say established, and then can from there blossom into something that's more accessible, forage and cover wise.
Got it.
Yeah, when a person, and this might be, even just from your selection process, but what would be an example of a property, and maybe you're just talking about it, that's just a diamond in the rough, where you're maybe on the surface, man, there's not a lot of habitat here, there's not a lot of water, maybe it was formerly just egg and kind of a little bit more of that moonscape, which definitely is a food source that the wildlife gravitate towards, but what would be that spot that a person maybe should take a look at but gets overlooked?
I would say some farms that may not look as pretty, but are in the next years to come very wildlife friendly, can be some that have been logged semi-aggressively. And so they're not going to look the best, but when we're talking about sunlight, which is where all this energy comes from plants, deer then respond to plants, or wildlife respond to the plants that are growing there or not growing there. We just open up the canopy a ton, right? So a lot of the work's been done. It's not going to look necessarily pretty, but if they've left some value, they've now have a road system potentially, but it's not going to look very good from the start. And a lot of times those get overlooked.
And the price,
cheap. And
they're timber, Ozark Mountains, the timber is, that's our landscape. We're almost all timber. We have pastures. There's a few places of the cross, but we're a timber part of the world. And those, Matt and I also do real estate. And so the ground that's the cheapest is the farms that had the timber cut hard, and everybody overlooks it and said it's just a thick, nasty mess. And I look at that and I'm like, I guarantee you there's good deer in there. And always find guys we have a buddy who year in, year out, he's harvesting deer that everybody in the neighborhood wishes they had. And what his farm is doing is what they're not doing. They want what he has, but they're not doing what he's doing. And a big part of that is harvesting timber. He's almost always, every 5 years, he's got some sort of harvest going on. And so there's always new growth coming up. There's treetops for good cover. And it's dynamite.
Is his, and this is just curious, so when he's harvesting timber, does he have enough, stands or blocks of timber that he's just doing another clear cut and getting a different age class of clear cut in there, or is he doing selective harvest and just opening up the canopy a little bit, or what's his strategy there?
Both, all of the above.
And TSI thrown in the mix.
Timber stand improvement thrown in the mix. So either they're doing timber stand improvement preparing for a future harvest, or they're doing timber stand improvement post-harvest to try to make sure that basically when you have a timber harvest, you're cutting the crop trees and you leave a lot of the weed trees. So then they go in and they do a timber stand improvement and they cut the weed trees and they leave the young crop trees for the next cut. So there's definitely a cycle there where somebody knows what they're doing. They can harvest timber much quicker. So it's not just cut it once in my lifetime and then let it go. It's very much I'm going to cut it, and in 15 years we may cut some more, and in 15 years we may cut some more. Oh, and by the way, in the meantime, we're going to have a lot better habitat for the wildlife.
And I think it's important to say too, the age and the varying ages of timber mean that there's diversity there and that it's holistic, right? A lot of people you'll see on real estate listings. Oh, mature timber, the whole place is mature timber. Well, I don't want just one stagnant age of timber. I need diversity across the place, and that means things are functioning. I have replacement trees. I have oak regeneration. You mentioned that earlier. So by doing these practices, logging, TSI, following things up, we're managing, and then the byproduct of that is multi-aged trees as well as great deer.
Yeah.
And you make money through the process.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, that mature timber is great. I can tell you the first thing I'm going to do is cut some of it, and like I said, you're generating some income, you're creating that diversity. I was going to ask another thing. It had to do with timber. Oh, I know. So I imagine a lot of what we just talked about, that, are recommendations that you guys are helping people with, like, okay, we're going to cut this, we're going to leave that, we're going to, do things, probably any number of ways, right? But is somebody, if you hire somebody to do that, I mean, how much direction do you have to give that person as far as, like, cut this tree, leave all these, get rid of these, like you're talking about? Is that stuff that you guys go in and direct, or is somebody that, has the equipment to cut trees, are they automatically going to be able to do that?
It depends. We do that. We assist some landowners, and others have a pretty good grasp where there's a subcon or a contractor in the neighborhood that we know, and we can send them in that direction and say, hey, we need you to go, manage that, help that landowner do a timber harvest. And a lot of people, if they're like-minded like us, it's, once again, 80 grit management. So it's like, if they cut that tree, it's not that big of a deal. We just need to make sure they don't cut all those trees that are like that, and that they're, once again, managing with the whole ecosystem in mind.
We rewrite and develop most of our plans in a way that is very digestible for the landowner themselves to realize what and when things are going to happen. And I've got actually a landowner today out of North Carolina meeting with the gentleman who'll be logging that property in the next couple months, but he has the plan. He says, hey, I'm just going to give this to the forester or the logger, and he's going to execute this, and he's going to be well on his way to know what should be done, where, what units, and ideally at what time frame as well.
And then are you guys, is there anything happening like, you're going through and like cruising it and like marking trees or anything like that? Or is it more just kind of get that rough plan in place and go for it?
We have a couple of guys that do that for us or work with us to do it. One of them being my brother, who actually works for the U.S. Forest Service. And when he's got time, we send him up there or to the project, and he does it. We operate from the consulting side. So we're just meeting new landowners, lining out the work. And then when it comes to actually implementing the work, typically we have to hand that off because we're too busy consulting. One thing I will say for you guys, you mentioned it early on, and I try to stress this to a lot of people, is, the dream is to own your own piece of ground. I think for a lot of us, that should be a really awesome dream. And then for the other guys who have leases and they say, well, I really can't do anything, I think a lot of that has to do with our message, and that we should really be kind of trying to change our message as hunters, to incorporate this mindset, incorporate this approach and this communication with landowners, because I think it could really gain a lot of guys some new ground to hunt. If you're going to that older couple who's owned the farm, it's been in their family forever, they don't allow hunting, they're only cattle farmers or they're only crop farmers, and you're like, hey, I would love the opportunity. I don't have my own family farm. I would love the opportunity to work with you guys. I've learned some really cool stuff that's really for the health of the ecosystem, whether it's pollinators or birds or turkeys or deer, whatever it is. Try to key in on what that landowner likes and try to incorporate that into your message to be the biggest part of it. Where I'm a hunter, yes, I love that, but most importantly, I love to manage the land and help people reach a healthier landscape. And I think people, if they change that message from, hey, can I shoot deer on your farm, to doing that sort of thing, I think people get a lot more yeses than nos.
Yeah, I'd say that's probably the case. Usually people like to tend to, if they're going to give you something just completely out of the blue, it's nice to sometimes get something in return.
Yeah, I mean, I think too, like, sometimes, you hear like, oh, if you get if you're seeking permission, see if you can offer some work, which is great, and I think people should do that. But then also, even though it's better than nothing, it's like a little bit more transactional, to where this is more, at least the way I'm hearing it or hearing you describe it, it's more of like, hey, I appreciate you letting me hunt here. Let me work your land. Let me improve your land. And, let's do this for the benefit of everybody. And you guys will hopefully get some enjoyment out of it. I'll get some enjoyment out of it. The landscape overall will be a healthier landscape. And I don't know, it just seems less transactional to me.
Yeah.
It's a very transparent way to work with the landowner, because you're connecting at, let's say, the stewardship of the land, and saying, hey, you guys care about this, and because you own it, right? And it means something to you, it means something to your family. I know I don't own it, but that doesn't mean I can't have a connection, and that I don't care about the health of the land and the health of the resources that are here. But here's some things that I've noticed and I've learned. I'd like to help you improve this because I'm seeing trees starting to die out, and I would approach it in this manner. And yes, I love to hunt, but at the same time, we're stewarding land with landowners, and that's kind of hard to say no to.
Or another big one is, hey, I've noticed that your woodlot is starting to fill in with a lot of invasive species in the understory. I don't know if you know this, but if that gets established in there, the next generation of oaks that you're hoping will occur will not. And that I'm hopeful that I can help you improve that, so that will remain an oak forest rather than a invasive chalked landscape.
I don't know, man. Just if I was a landowner right now and I heard that, I'd be like, man, this guy sounds like he knows what he's talking about. I should probably let him on and do some work.
For sure. Man. Yeah, now I've just been thinking about chainsawing trees in my head.
Well, he mentioned pollinators. I'm thinking about keeping bees again, Jim.
Oh, not again.
They die.
For you, when it comes to the pollinators too, I think a lot of times immediately our head goes to honeybees, when there's a lot of solitary bees that we can do things for on the landscape that can really help. They're a much more efficient pollinator than a honeybee, and so you can do different boxes or basically. They look like a little structure with bamboo tunnels in it that they can use. Or one of the big things that people do that's not great for pollinators is running a bush hog all the time. So you see these old fields where it's a lot of weeds, lots of forbs, as we call them. In the winter, that's where there's a large amount of insects that use those fallow fields. And then if we bush hog them down, we're ultimately killing them. So there's just so many things we can do for pollinators, for songbirds.
Well, and at the same time, you're talking about fields of pollinators. As a turkey poult, you need places to brood. 70% of a diet of a young bird is insects. Well, where are the insects going to be? They're going to be where the flowers are, where the pollinating action is happening. So by having pollinators, sure, you can do things for the pollinator species, but there's wild game implications too.
And because all those plants that are pollinators or forbs in a young stage are deer food. And so it's basically food plots that you don't have to plant every single year, which tie it back to the deer hunters and go, man, that's another acre. When you look at it from a deer manager, you're saying, okay, each acre of my farm should either be food or cover or water somewhere in the mix. And so if you can take old fields, which have a mixture of shrubs, which probably can provide woody browse, you've got areas that not only provide food year-round, but also provide year-round cover. And then you have your ice cream areas of food plots. And so if you do that and you look at every single acre as an opportunity to help you reach your goals, you have way less wasted space of areas that aren't providing anything for the deer, and you're just paying taxes on them. So I don't like that scenario.
Nobody likes paying taxes on stuff you can't use.
No doubt about it.
No,
I mean, when you boil land management down, it's really just anti-big government and taxes, Jim.
Paying for stuff you ain't using. Boy, ain't that
No, that's super
worst.
interesting. Like you said, you got a natural food plot with native species and pollinators, and I don't know. Sounds like all good things to me.
Do you ever find that like somebody's property? I'm thinking like if somebody starts doing a lot of this stuff on their property, they're probably going to obviously make their property very attractive to a lot of the wildlife, which it seems like, actually, I'm thinking to myself, I'm trying to think of like neighbors. Let's say if you've got neighbors around a property that are all basically doing everything wrong, it would seem like actually in some ways it's not necessarily going to screw with what the one landowner that you're working with has going on. And it almost actually makes their place look even better, right? Or is there stuff that a neighbor might be doing where you're like, hey, neighbor, let's both try and fix some stuff because right now you're screwing me up too. Does that ever happen?
Very common,
totally.
Very common scenario that a lot of our clients find themselves in, and or way back and forth as they're improving their own place. They're seeing, hey, I'm a diamond in the rough right now, but we do know most wildlife species that people are trying to promote, or their goals are oriented around, they don't know property boundaries. So you want to, truthfully, it does have a landscape effect and not just a necessarily property effect. You are only in control of your property, but education with your success to surrounding neighbors is then only going to make your property better. Get everyone on board, because let's just use deer for example. Bucks, yearlings, they're going to disperse from their home range sometimes 2 miles, 3 miles, could be more in different varying landscapes, right? So that buck that you may shoot at 5, he didn't necessarily come from your property. He was not born on your property. But if you have a landscape where when his first year birth is very critical, you want him the best resources. So your neighbor, as a crow flies 2 miles away, now is actually very important to you. Turkeys, they have huge ranges, 8 miles in the fall, and sometimes. So depending on the resources, if they're traveling, your neighbors, really, you want them to be as healthy of a landscape as you are.
Yeah. And for the guys that have terrible relations with their neighbors, yes, if you're 200 acres and you're doing all this stuff that's you believe that is benefiting the land, and you're doing micro clear cuts of these bedding thickets, you're doing timber stand improvement, you're doing edge feathering, you're doing old field management, you're removing invasives. Yeah, you will be the diamond in the rough. But ultimately, you're changing the hunting scenarios to where deer are spending more time on your place. But overall, you're probably not changing the overall health of the landscape to where that 4.5-year-old buck, rather than being 140 inches, he's now 160. No, that's probably not occurring, but at least your hunting is getting better. So it's kind of a win-win either way. Honestly, you would rather have the neighborhood involved, but at the same time, we deal with this a lot with our clients, because everybody seems like they're on an island, but you do a little bit of work and you're like, whoa, I'm really beating up on the neighbors now. I've got all the deer during the rut. And that's pretty awesome too.
You hold a lot more deer over into older age classes when you control the cover in an area.
Yeah.
I would imagine that could create, just like, a solid property working well and accomplishing these things that we're talking about, almost being, your guys' best advertising tool, as well as almost creating like a Cold War of habitat improvement, where
Cold War.
Where, you've got this, this amazing property or missile, and then now you've got all the property and the missiles, and now somebody else, they kind of want those same things.
I can just picture their next pitch now. Let's say you've got this missile, and it's really good, but your neighbor builds a bigger missile that's even better.
You're explaining it better than...
you're going to want an even bigger missile. Yeah.
Most deer hunters, probably by now, 2021, most guys who even a lot of people who have leases have the ability to plant food plots. A lot of guys are still putting out mineral. A lot of guys are still dumping feed out. There's not a lot of guys who are managing timber in the degree that we are recommended to our landowners. There's not a lot of guys removing and fighting invasives like a lot of our landowners are. There's not a lot of guys even removing non-natives. So one of the big ones is cool season turf grasses like tall fescue, or probably in your part of the world, smooth brome, reed canary grass. Those are just in many places in the U.S. And I mean, you can watch XYZ ABC hunting show and probably see a deer walking through an old field and see a blanket of cool season non-native grass. And you're like, if you remove that, just in one treatment of herbicide, if you remove that, you would probably go from having maybe, I don't know, 200 to 500 pounds of forage available per acre for the deer to 3,000. It's not that hard.
Unbelievable.
You don't know what you don't know. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, I've watched so many hunting shows where it's just like, for me as a plant guy, I'm like, I wish I knew that guy's number, because I could call and tell him how to make that place even better.
Well, and that's the thing. Everyone, you're at an equal bar. Let's say if you're expecting your neighbors to be food plotting, supplemental feeding, you step up the game by actually impacting the native landscape, which is when we look at like a whole calendar year, we're seeing that's what actually supports wildlife. That is what is allowing them to, successfully reproduce, rear young, and forage across the entire landscape and property. You want to impact your property, you want to step it up from your neighbors, do something different. And these type of techniques, they're not that common, but when you do them and you can back it with science to say, well, I'm going to take this acre of closed canopy timber that was producing maybe 50 to 100 pounds of food per acre annually, and I clear cut that exact same acre, I've got 1,000 pounds of food in that acre. And I didn't plant anything. I didn't do anything besides cut those trees and restart it as young forest.
Cover.
And exactly. And I got 1,000 pounds of food, and it's great cover. That's where the deer are going to be. Those are real numbers that you can apply to a landscape and drastically increase the overall tonnage produced and cover. And really, most neighbors aren't doing that. And it's not hard. It's just, how do you lay that out spatially on a property to make sure as a hunter, you benefit from those and not necessarily your neighbor, or you make it in conjunction with a accessible food plot. I know where the deer is bedded at now. And when he gets up and walks, he's going to walk through that edge feathering and come out to this food plot that I got in and out of. No deer knew I was there. Yeah. That's what makes the difference.
And I think so many times we've fallen into belief that says that I want bigger deer. Well, how do I get bigger deer? I guess plant more food plots, or I need more crops. No, I don't know why we keep going back to this. We're smarter than this. We know that deer were here long before food plots or crop fields were put on the landscape. So how were they making their living? They were making it off of native plants, whether it was forbs in the summer,
weeds,
or browse in the winter, and a combination of both
and
in between.
Mass producing trees.
And so for us, it's very enjoyable to have landowners who are like, I don't even want food plots. I live far away. I'm just going to manage with these bedding thickets, edge feathering, TSI, and property that we manage around my family farm. We had it's about 400 some acres and about 6 acres of food plots. And when a deer like this shows up, I don't know if you can see that, but
sweet.
That's a large.
Yeah.
We dropped his sheds and we found he's a 193-inch buck. That's pretty stinking rare for our part of the world. There are a few that come in every year in this whole 4-county region around us, but it's not very common. And I think when you see a deer like that pop up, it's like, okay, we know we're doing something right.
Yeah, pop up after having a timber harvest, after doing prescribed fire, after doing all these other techniques that have been implemented right there in that home range, we have results. And that's just one example of something that we saw in southern Missouri, but there's hundreds of clients across the country sharing those same exact type of experiences. Maybe it's not a 192-inch deer, but for their respective area, they're killing great deer. And there's been multiples.
When a guy in southern Michigan sends you a picture and he's killed a 157, wasn't it? Something like that?
162. Actually.
Okay, 162. That's pretty good for Michigan. And so, we hear that from landowner after landowner. It's like, okay, we know something's right. Or when a landowner says, hey, I just killed a 239-inch buck and it's unbelievable. This place is going crazy. And I'm like, okay, I know it's amazing. Let's talk about the deer. This is cool. But can we please take a little bit of a sidebar and say, did you hear any quail while you were hunting? Oh my gosh, more quail than I've ever heard in my whole life. They were everywhere. Walking in and out, we were jumping them and there's pheasants cackling. It's like, okay, that's what I wanted to hear. Because I know that, you can grow big deer and not have good quail, but you can't have great quail and not have good deer.
Right.
Because quail require a much healthier landscape than whitetail deer. Deer are very adaptive. You could have a suburb full of invasives and deer still do okay. As long as you get them to age, there's a good chance they might be a pretty good sized buck. But you can't have quality quail numbers and have mediocre habitat.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is true. I mean, you can have a deer eating your rose bushes, but you don't have a covey of quail in your lawn.
No.
This is true.
In my experience, Jim.
I can see how somebody would oftentimes, like I know myself, and I can see how a lot of people would need a consult for something like this, because I'm just going to, places I've been, properties I've been to and stuff, and you look out at it though, and if you don't know, have the agricultural background, you don't know anything. I mean, you look at it and you're like, well, there's some trees and there's some green stuff on the ground, and some of it sticks up higher than the other stuff, and I mean, you always hear, I think, Matt, you mentioned earlier that people are always talking about like, oh, it's got big mature trees in it, and that's almost like this thing that everybody shoots for, is like having this cool looking forest with big mature timber in it, and to think about, well, you go in there and I guess we're gonna cut some of this down. It's like some of these trees have probably been here for a really long time. You feel kind of funny about it. You're like, boy, it took a long time for them to get here. So if I cut the wrong ones down, then that's not going to happen again for another 50 years or something like that. So I don't know. There's a lot of stuff that I look at when you see some of this stuff where you're potentially talking about making some big changes that would change stuff for a long time. I bet you get a lot of people who get kind of like nervous when you start talking about cutting these trees, and they're like, these trees have been in my family for generations. Like I used to swing on this tree as a kid or something, right? I mean,
my grandpa planted this tree.
Yeah.
I think it's, and that's honestly why at the start of every single consultation, we ask about the goals. We say, what is it you're trying to achieve? And then once we get into a situation like that, we can say, okay, based on your goals, what you communicated to us, if we were to not do something, this is what the habitat is going to look like 10, 20 years down the road. We can project that, right? And we could say, this is the value that's going to have or probably not going to have if we don't do anything. But then on the flip side, we say, okay, I know that you may be nervous. We call it analysis paralysis, because you think so much, you don't actually end up doing anything. So we say, if you do that, nothing's going to happen. But on the flip side, if we do the practices that I recommend, you follow these guidelines, I know that this is going to happen. And when we're talking about taking an area and multiplying it by 10 times the amount of food and then adding the cover value added to that exact acre, it kind of is a no-brainer saying, well, science tells me this, nature's going to do this, deer are then going to relate to this, I'm going to have more wildlife on the property. It makes those decisions that seem tough prior to having knowledge of working the landscape now really easy, because someone's come in and said, here's what's going to happen, and I'm going to guide you through this process to say, don't do this, make sure you do that, and then you get your result.
Well, so one of the things that we say to almost every single landowner is, with their stated goals, okay, now let's put our business owner cap on and say, okay, this is not land, this is a business, and we're in the business of reaching this goal, X amount of sales or whatever the goal may be. So my goal is to have healthier habitat, more wildlife, but I don't want to touch those trees because Papaw planted them. Okay, well, see those trees that he planted. Do you see the other 10 that are growing in relation to it that are junk trees? And I mean, this is almost every single forest that we go into in the course of a year and say, yeah, it's great timber, but there's always weed trees. There's always junk. It doesn't matter how great it is. There's always trees that aren't going to be harvested now or 100 years from now because they're the wrong species, or they're crooked, or they're already hollow. And so as a business owner, we have our employees who help us reach our goals. Well, as a landowner, we have our employees, which are the plant communities, and there's plants that are bad employees. And we can either fire those employees and kill them, or we can change their role and say, hey, you're not in marketing anymore. You're going down to the warehouse and you're doing inventory. And so we can take a junk tree and cut that tree. And instead of trying to act like it's growing timber, we fired it and sprayed the stump and killed it, or we just cut it and changed this role. Now it's a little 3-foot tall stump sprout that's providing pretty good cover and great forage.
Well, I tell you what, that's a real cutthroat job. Hey, look, you haven't been performing haven't been performing the way we've expected, so you're dead.
When you see a chainsaw at your performance review, look out.
That's right. That is right.
What's that for? Oh, can I just go?
These are employees that don't talk back, so or file lawsuits, so you should be good.
That is a good thing.
What a concept.
Well, yeah, and so many quotation mark like non-native species, if you don't know, they look as part of the natural landscape as anything else.
I'll tell you about one that I ran into that I thought at first, I was like, oh, look, it's just a bush. And then I learned that bush was actually a literal monster, is Japanese knotweed. You guys ever run into that stuff?
Not weed?
Not weed.
No.
Sorry, maybe it's weed. I don't know. I actually, because I'm not super familiar with the stuff. All I know is that the shoots kind of look like rhubarb, and it's got these big green leaves on it, and you can't kill it. It won't die.
It's very difficult. You got to take definitely the right prescriptions and the right follow-up herbicides. But a lot of times it gets in riparian areas. It's got to have wet feet, and it can travel through creek systems. The seed source can. So someone upstream not handling or attacking, let's say, that colony of knapweed is Japanese
Knotweed
or something. Yeah.
Yeah, it goes downstream now. Everyone else is affected by it too. So, it's important to be able to identify plants. And I know we're nerds when it comes to plants, but we get paid to be. And our clients, they might be top of their field, and as a lawyer or as a doctor, they're not necessarily expected to know everything. So that's how we can come in and help and say, hey, this is an issue. It could be kind of like a cancer, right? An area that we need to go in and treat quickly before it expands and becomes a really big problem. Let's do that. But yeah, that's why we have jobs to come in and do that on the landscape.
Yeah. I call that knotweed, I call it green Satan.
Otherwise known as.
AKA.
What like for a person, like maybe you have, like 5 acres or 10 acres, or maybe you're blessed with, 300 acres or whatever. But like, what's the minimum where you're like, man, I can really have like an impact there? Is that everybody?
It depends.
God, I'm asking all the.
Way to go, Mark.
I know.
That we work with you worked with a guy in Maryland, wasn't it?
Well, one guy in Virginia who was 16 acres, and then one in Maryland just over 20, and then in April I'll be in Pennsylvania for 11 acres.
Okay,
right on.
And we worked a property. Well, it was the first year we were working as Land and Legacy, and we had a 24-acre property that had a shop on it, kind of a big turnaround area. So a whole acre devoted to the shop and parking lot. And I think when Matt and I both left, this was back when we were consulting together. And when we left, we were like, "Ooh, that's going to be a tough property to reach the goals that guy stated." Well, lo and behold, 3 years in, it was the number one property for inches of antler harvested. And it was like just the right 24 acres where it connected 2 wood lots, and all the deer went through that area. And whenever he started cutting and making it, he added a lot of cover. He made the property sticky. So when a deer went through, it stuck to it for a few days. And whenever he caught him on camera, he went in and got him. And it was like he shot 2 deer over 160 and another one almost 140 in 2 years. And it was just like, this is insane. I'll never judge a property by its initial walkthrough ever again. And I think that so many guys, when you think about it, a deer doesn't bed down on an acre. A deer beds down in something this big. And so if you can make that occur on your property more times than not, you've got a better chance of killing that deer.
On a smaller property, a lot of times what we're talking about is square footage. That becomes super important. Maybe not necessarily measuring things in acres, but I think that it's almost a responsibility as a landowner, no matter how much you own, to take care of it. Again, whether you're passionate or not, you are the owner. It's like a house, right? If you see a dilapidated house, the city's going to say, hey, you need to do something about that. Well, as a landowner, we need to be advocates out there talking to neighbors. Whether you have 5 acres or 500, you need to be doing the right stuff on a property and not just neglecting it, because neglect is one of the worst things that can happen for a property.
Sounds like you're the guy that'd call HOA on your neighbor.
I don't live in HOA.
Nobody likes that guy.
Have you guys had any success stories where, maybe a person went in with a certain set of goals, but then over time they're like, oh man, I was never a quail hunter, but now we can hunt quail on our property, or I wasn't super into turkeys, the property wasn't holding turkeys, but now we got a ton of turkeys and we love to hunt turkeys. Are people increasing, I guess, the number of recreational opportunities on their property?
Absolutely,
without a doubt.
I can think of this just about a month ago. I had 2 clients on the same day reach out in Kansas. One of them sent me a picture of a quail in his hand. He said, this is the first quail on my property. Over the course of this winter, we had 5 different coveys. And this is something that we're really enjoying, and we're looking forward to moving forward in the future, hunting quail as well as deer and turkeys. Had another client in kind of north central Kansas said that, hey, I just want to kind of work on tweaking a few things and make sure I'm headed in the right direction. This winter, when we were pheasant hunting, we had about 35 to 40 of them on the property, and they were flying and going over to the neighbor to eat Milo and then coming back to roost on me. So we kind of tweaked the plan. We added some Milo to his farm, laid it out. So this spring he'll be planting the Milo, but he's starting to see healthy populations of pheasants and quail. We have I think of an analogy of a client up in near the Missouri River in central Missouri that never saw turkeys on their farm. They started implementing some prescribed fire and bedding thickets and edge feathering, and all of a sudden turkeys started using their place more than the neighbors. They're like, we've never seen turkeys in those fields. And so now we have the ability to turkey hunt them. So, that's just a few clients I've dealt with.
And a lot of it, we see the recreational property begin to transform into, there's hunting season, but then there's however many months, let's say 8 months out of the year, that a lot of people in a recreational world, they're not doing much with the farm, but our landowners, that is their time to shine. They've got 8 months to be able to, revamp things, improve things, move on down the management plan, checking things off the list. And I've had a lot of guys who call and say, hey, I am very passionate about big deer. That's my focus. Let's do it. As season ends, they're more excited for, let's say, land management season than they are for the opening day of bow season, because their family's out there and enjoying the property. And it takes away, let's say, some of that, I don't want to call it selfishness, but you as a deer hunter, you're in the stand, let's say probably by yourself. This is ways that people can enjoy properties as a family, as a whole, share more memories together. And there's change. There's lessons to be learned through the transformation of land, the working of land. And that's what a lot of people we see is a big light bulb. They never knew that when they became a landowner, that they would be passionate about it, care about it as much as they are, or have the opportunity to connect with their wife or with their kids as much as they do now, because there's something else to bring them back together.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really, really good point. And I like that a lot. Like you said, deer hunting can be, pretty solitary. Oftentimes it does mean if you have a, family or young family, you are taking that selfish time to be away from them, unless you're taking your kids with you if they're old enough, or you think they're old enough, or they're mature enough, or have the interest even, right? But yeah, being able to go out and do those things, you don't have to be quiet. You don't have to sneak around. You can
worry about your scent.
Worry about your scent, yeah, and just go have fun with the family. Like I said, lots of great lessons to be learned and good quality family time. I like that.
Heck yeah.
I'm gonna try and sell it that way around my house, Jim.
With the wives of clients who really start to like the wildflower side of it, or the sunflower plot that they planted for the doves. And pretty soon they're like, my wife's coming with me almost every weekend to the farm to see the flowers and see what's blooming now, and or to see what birds are around. And it's like, when a client's doing that, it's like, I know that farm's likely never going to sell. That's something that the whole family is enjoying. And I think now, 2021, there's no better time for families to be getting outside and enjoying nature. And
For sure.
And that really pulls in, honestly, our full name and our full approach, land and legacy. That's what creates a lasting legacy with the land, is sharing those type of memories. You can do that from a deer stand, absolutely, but it doesn't have to start and end with the beginning and end of deer season. It can be a full year-round enjoyment with family, and that's super important. Again, is a long-lasting deal, because that's how we grew up. We grew up with family memories on the land, and gosh, I wouldn't trade that for anything.
No.
Yep.
A lot of this quotation mark, ancillary stuff that you're talking about is probably, at the end of the day, the more meaningful stuff.
Oh man, yeah. I mean, even I remember growing up myself on, I think our family had like 1.5 acres, but the house was situated in such a way it felt like you had no neighbors, and it was on a big hill. And like the amount of times I climbed the one maple tree, fell off, went sledding down the hill, scraped my face up on the ice and snow, like mountain biked all around the yard when I first got my mountain bike. It's like the best place ever. And then of course we moved from it, and it's still like any other house that we moved to growing up after that. It was like I didn't even care about. It was just that one.
Pales in comparison.
That's right. If you can't mountain bike around the yard, it's useless.
No, I like that. I think that's about as perfect as a way as we can close this out, as far as land and legacy and everything that's intertwined in that, because it really is a legacy, and it's more than just big deer. It's it's the overall health of the landscape, it's the overall health of your family, and man, all good things link back to the land.
Absolutely. Good stuff, guys. Well, yeah, we appreciate you guys joining us. Thank you very much. Yeah, do you guys have anything else though as we kind of close it out?
Guys, we appreciate the time and enjoy conversing with you all. Hopefully there's a lot of other people out there who will join in and share their same interest in improving the land and learn from this opportunity. But we thank you guys.
And where do people find you if they're curious?
They can find us at www.landandlegacy.tv or on Facebook, Instagram, email us at inlandlegacy.tv, and we'll be in touch, or shoot us a message on social media.
I think we got we had just a slight blip there on the connection. What was the Instagram? Is it just at Land and Legacy?
At Land and Legacy. Yeah.
Right on.
That
All right.
sign. Yeah.
Pretty easy peasy then. So, yeah. For those listening out there, though, check these guys out when you get the chance. And if you're watching on YouTube or you want to comment over on Instagram, definitely do that at Vortex Nation Podcast. Let us know if you got a piece of land you're thinking of doing something with, or if you've done some stuff. Yeah, we'd love to hear about it, as usual. So thanks, everybody, for listening. We'll catch you on the next one. Bye.
Bye.
There you have it, folks. Thank you very much for listening. As usual, give this video a like if you liked it, comment something below, and give us a subscribe to the Vortex Nation podcast channel. It would mean a lot to us. Also, why don't you give us a follow over on Instagram while you're at it, at Vortex Nation Podcast. We'd love to hear from you over there, and we'll keep you updated with all kinds of cool photos and videos from our adventures that we do here. Otherwise, we will see you on the next one. Thank you again. Happy hunting and shooting, everybody. Have a good one.